Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the program manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. Today's webinar will provide an update of the R2 certification program standard, which will be presented by Sean Vries, who I will introduce in a moment. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question or comment, you can use the Q&A feature located on the control panel on your screen. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. And also please note that the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center, its affiliates, funders, and the National Recycling Coalition assume no liability resulting from the use of any information provided during this webinar. This webinar is only provided as an informational tool and no discrimination is intended and no endorsement by these organizations is applied. Sean Vries was appointed by SERI, the Sustainable Electronics Recycling International, to the position of R2 Director in October of 2018. Among his responsibilities, Sean works with the R2 Technical Advisory Committee and leads the R2 standard development process. He also provides guidance for the application and implementation of the standard and educates various stakeholder groups. Sean brings considerable experience in standards development and oversight for the electronics industry and electronics reuse industry. Prior to joining SERI, Sean was a director of the Recycler Qualification Office, and an organization established to audit and approve reuse and recycling organizations prior to use under the industry-led end-of-life electronics recycling programs across Canada. He also led the development process for the Electronics Reuse and Refurbishing Program and the Recycler Qualification Program. Sean was also active in the development and implementation of the provincial electronic stewardship programs and served as the chair of the board of directors for the not-for-profit stewardship organizations. Sean holds college advanced diplomas in environmental engineering technology and environmental science from Georgian College, Barrie, Ontario. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean.
All right, thank you, Wayne. And hello and welcome, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us today and, of course, for this opportunity to be able to provide you an update on R2 and changes that have happened in the standard over the past, well, I guess 5 years overall in terms of the update process, but released as of last July. So today I'm going to share with you some high-level information on the R2v3 standard. And particularly what I want to focus on are some highlights of what the key changes were and how that applies to different organizations really in the electronics collection, repair, and recycling sectors. So we won't be looking at really a detailed review of all the requirements themselves today, but I hope to be able to map out for you really these key aspects and in particular some of the connections within the standard between the different requirements and so that you can see where those apply. And of course, because there's much more information that I'm going to be able to cover here today, I'm going to review with you some of the resources that we do have available that are on our new website and where you can find those. And then, of course, we'll take a look at the R2v3 transition timeline at the end, and you can see what this means for the R2 certifications. So I wanted to start today with this snapshot of the global impact of R2 and give you an idea of the scope and the stretch of R2 activities as they currently stand. This number changes every day, so the numbers aren't exact right now, but we're at about 950 certified facilities, R2 certified facilities, sorry, that operate globally. And based on these numbers and the map, you can see that we have quite a wide stretch where there's implementation. But obviously, we recognize there's some regions here in which the numbers are lower and certainly opportunities for us to expand the reach of R2. And so that's one of the goals that SERI has overall, beyond just the R2 standard, but in terms of responsible and sustainable electronics management. So for a little bit of background here, in terms of developing the R2v3 standard, this process itself was very significant because we had to manage that in accordance with the ANSI requirements for standard setting. And by doing that, it's resulted in R2v3 being recognized as an American national standard. So as an ANSI-accredited standards developer, SERI maintains a documented process which includes review of the standard every 5 years. And this is really a continual improvement process and something that would be part of most standards. So in this development process, um, really it begins with the current version of the standard. In this case, it was the R2 2013 standard. And of course, there's been lots of lessons learned over the years from implementing that standard, from auditing to it, and really the oversight activities as well. So when we look at that, there's a lot of opportunity for changes and improvements to the standard itself, but also the industry really has changed since that point in time. And so these are some of the key things that we needed to be accounted for and considered in this review process. So an R2 Technical Advisory Committee, or the TAC as we call it, that was formed to really do the review and discuss the changes to the standard. So the TAC is a balanced stakeholder group. We have representatives from facilities that certify to the R2 standard. Then there's a group of organizations that really contract with those certified facilities. Those are the customers, we call them. And then we have the other stakeholders like regulators, auditors, and consultants. So these different stakeholder groups, and we balance our membership across those groups, but it's key to have all these various stakeholders as part of the process. So our review began back in 2015, and because the revision was based on the current version of R2 2013, a lot of what you're going to see, if you're familiar with that version, is going to be familiar to you in R2v3. And so the intent here really, when we looked at the revision, wasn't just to change things for the sake of change, but it's about updating the standard, clarifying requirements, or just improving requirements where there could have been gaps and things like that. But really, the general principles behind the requirements, they also remain the same. So a lot of carryover that you're going to notice. Pardon me. Through the TAC development process, then the draft standard, as we get to that point, we make the changes, redline the standard, and we post that for public review and comment. And so we actually had 2 public review periods with this version of the standard. And so in addition to all the other changes that the TAC had considered over their deliberations, through these public comment period, we received 660 comments. And each one of those had to be reviewed and considered by the TAC as well as possible opportunities for changes or just for clarification to the standard as well. So once the TAC had settled on that final text, standard was approved by the consensus body, which is a subset of the TAC, and then it's adopted by the SERI board of directors. And finally, by following this process, having our approvals in place, it gets adopted by ANSI as an American national standard, as I mentioned. So I try to point all this out in this process in particular because the key to this revision and this process and really the ANSI approval overall is about credibility of the standard and of the audit and the certification process and recognition for those. So it's not just about the standard, but that entire certification process that we want to focus on. And we want to ensure that when customers look at R2, they're also seeing the value in the R2 certification. They have confidence in it and continued value in what they see. So there's 3 primary documents that are part of the R2v3 certification process. We start off with the standard itself. And so those are the auditable requirements that the R2 facilities have to meet and that they're audited against. There's the R2 equipment categorization, or you'll hear us refer to that as the REC document. And so this is a reference document. It's used in conjunction with the standard, and it helps determine the R2 status and what the next proper processing step is for any equipment or materials that a facility is managing. And then the last document is the code of practices. And this is basically the rules that the certification bodies follow for auditing and certifying to R2v3. So I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail so you have some more background on them and understand their role in the certification process. So if we start with the code of practices, this is really used to define everything related to the audit and the certification processes. It's basically, like I said, the rules that the certification bodies follow, and it's for how they conduct the audits, but also how they issue certifications or certificates to R2v3. And it also really has to obviously align with the standard itself. So this is a new version of the code of practices that's specific to the R2v3 standard, as opposed to the one that was used for the 2013 standard. So things that the code of practices identifies are the overall audit process, the steps that need to be taken, roles and qualifications for the certification body staff, which can be from the auditors to the package reviewers to the program manager. We also have in there a complaints process for how those are managed, whether it's complaints against a CB, whether it's a complaints against an R2 facility. And then there's requirements or communication requirements in there between CBs and SERI and how that takes place. So for R2 facilities, probably the most important aspects that get covered in the code of practices are that it defines really the non-conformance process. So when there are issues identified, how are they followed up on? What are the steps that are required to take to close those out? And then also there's audit time requirements that are covered in the code of practices. So that's basically how long is an audit going to be for certification or surveillance, depending on the type of operations. And so in terms of those audit times, really what we tried to do is establish those based on a number of variables. And the key here is the more that a facility does, the more audit time is going to be required. But then on the flip side, the simpler an operation is, and the less audit time they're going to require. So when we look at small facilities, we're looking at basically 1 day on core requirements. And I'll talk a little bit about core requirements in a second here. And then there would be no audit time if they add on, if they're using R2 certified downstream vendors. So there's also a requirement in the standard that they maintain environmental health and safety management system. And so there's a lot of crossover requirements. What we tried to do is allow for some of that audit time to be used for R2 processes and to audit the R2 example. So that's where you're really going to see the audit time. When you look at a larger facility, they would rather than a day at the core, would probably be around a day and a half for those operations to be audited. And then if they're doing things like data sanitization, that could add a day and a quarter, or a test and repair could be a day and a half. And really, again, it's based on variables. So the amount of implementation and the different activities that the organization's doing is really going to reflect in those audit times. So another significant area of change in this code of practices is the integration of remote auditing processes. And so this is really in addition to the traditional on-site audit. And what we see is this is going to allow for more flexibility in scheduling the audit. It allows an audit to be broken up into kind of manageable chunks of time rather than a single run through of several days to get through these audits. And obviously it can be a benefit to R2 facilities to save on some lot of costs and travel costs and things like that to have auditors on site. Now, I would say we really explored this area already through the current restrictions that we've had based on the pandemic and auditors not being able to travel and sometimes facilities not being able to allow individuals into the facility. And so remote auditing has already been used, and I would say quite successful. I think there's been some very good examples of how we can better use time. And so that's what we really want to focus on with this. So in addition to the R2 or the standard itself, R2v3 also contains this separate reference document that I mentioned, and that's the R2 equipment categorization. And so it's really important to note the auditable requirements are still within the standard. The rec doesn't include auditable requirements itself, but what it does is it contains reference tables, and those are what are used to ensure consistency in the application of the requirements, basically. So there's two main purposes of the R2 equipment categorization, and they apply at different points within the processing chain. So if we look first at the state of the electronic equipment or components or materials within a facility at any point in the process, the rec is going to help us determine what's that next step in processing. And because once things are processed, the state of that item changes. And so the applicability can also change. As an example, if computer comes in the door, it is a whole unit. It can be broken into many different parts. Some of them may be focused materials and have to be managed, whereas others would be non-focused materials and could follow that flow. So that's really what we're trying to do here. And these processing categories are quite straightforward. So the first thing that an organization has to do is determine if something is what we call R2 controlled, and therefore it requires further R2 processing. And this is really anything that is it's unevaluated. So anything that just comes in the door and we haven't done anything with it yet, we have to control it by default. So it's an R2 controlled stream. Things that are unsanitized, when it's a hard drive or a computer or a phone and it hasn't gone through data sanitization yet, it has to be controlled. And then equipment that's ready for test and repair or being directed to that, as well as focus material. So anything that requires further R2 processing must be an R2 controlled stream. The other processing category that we look at is used to determine the data sanitization status. So if something's pre-sanitization, that just means that it requires data security controls and sanitization. So it needs to follow that path. And again, it's pretty simple and straightforward functionally. And I think when there's an organized facility, they really do manage and can easily identify and distinguish between what's a controlled and unrestricted stream, as well as data and non-data devices. But incorporating this into the standard, this categorization, really it embeds that functionality into the standard. So we can ensure that all streams are properly managed and people are properly following the right pathway for processing. So the other side of the classification tables is really for functioning products. And this is after we've done some sort of R2 process with them. We know these products are destined for reuse. So the REC provides categories that can be used to identify the level of functionality and then also the cosmetic condition of the equipment. So these categories are intended to provide more detail on the condition of a product by replacing what we currently use as these broad categories of ready for reuse, ready for resale, or ready for repair. So much more detailed level of functionality. And then that description of cosmetic, parts missing, defects, and things like that also give a good understanding of what that cosmetic condition actually is. So what's important here is the actual specific categories and terminology from the REC do not need to be used. There is an option as long as the organization can demonstrate that they use similar categories, they map those categories or terminology to what's in the REC, then they can continue to use their own internal or industry categories, whichever ones that they're already using. So again, the key is not so much on what the terminology is, but identifying the state of those items and making sure they're directed to the right processing step. And the benefit of doing this really and having these standardized categories is that R2 facilities can now recognize a process that's already been completed by another facility. So it's not necessary for them to repeat that work. An example would be if I'm buying sanitized used hard drives that have been tested and repaired, I can use those in the repair of an item or sale for sale as is, and I don't need to redo that test. I don't need to redo the sanitization if it's already been done. So some benefits and some efficiencies in this process. So finally, we get to the R2v3 standard itself. And the biggest change in this version is the restructuring of the standard. And there's this new modular approach, as we call it, where requirements are divided into two sections. So we have core requirements that are applicable to all R2 facilities, and then process requirements, which are as applicable to the operations. So the reason for this structure is to accommodate what I mentioned earlier about the changes in and so the accommodate kind of how diverse the industry has gotten. And we have R2 facilities that from collectors to organizations that could focus in refurbishing, other areas that are organizations that just focus in materials recovery. And so they're very unique functions. And the standard has to be able to accommodate that. And there's also a variety of facilities that would perform kind of a wide variety of any of these activities or bits and pieces of each. So this is really the intent of this modular approach to the standard. R2v3 is not a one size fits all solution. I would say that. So what's important here though is although not every facility is going to perform every R2 operation, The value in this approach, though, is that once equipment goes into the R2 stream, a supplier can still be confident that it's handled in accordance with the R2 requirements. So whether the facility does it itself or whether they outsource it to a qualified downstream vendor, it's still going to meet the R2 requirements. This just gives the customer the ability to see the actual processes that an organization undertakes. So here you can see the listing of the 10 core requirements. And I'm not going to go through these in detail today because, again, these are very similar to what the existing 2013 requirement is. And these are really what I call the foundational elements of the standard. So it's based on a lot of the existing requirements that are in there. One of the notable exceptions is the sorting and categorization and processing in section 6. And this section replaces in part the reusable equipment and components section of R2 2013. And that's also covered in part in the test and repair process requirement. So I'm going to talk about those a little further so you understand how those changes were, or why those changes were made, how they impact those sections. And a few other key changes in the core requirements that I would say are notable from the 2013 version. A closure plan and financial instrument is still required for the most part under the Section 9 facility requirements, but there is an exemption for from the financial instrument requirement for certain small, low-risk facilities. And so there's several conditions they would need to meet to be exempt from that financial assurance requirement. Also, the pollution liability insurance requirement is not it within the core requirements now. It's been moved to higher risk appendices of A and E, and so we'll talk about those when they get there. It's for the downstream chain. If an organization is managing negative value materials, those that are going to incur a cost, they would have to have pollution liability insurance there. And then under E, if they're performing those material recovery applications. And then finally, the existing requirement in 2013 that's in place for verifying some regulatory authorizations and insurance and things like that for transporters, that one's been revised. That's actually removed and addressed through the applicable legal requirements and core requirement 4. So this is more now focused on how are things required to be packaged, labeled, manifesting requirements, things like that. So we'll take a look now more specifically at some of the key changes in the standard. And I mentioned this modular approach to the standard and that not all requirements will apply to all facilities. So since each facility is going to have different types of operations, this scope under core requirement 1 is really going to be a critical aspect of defining the details and the extent of the certification. So prior to the audit, the benefit here is the scope section really helps an organization understand their operations and determine which R2 process requirements apply. And then after the organization is certified, the scope's really going to provide greater clarity and transparency into those activities of each R2 certified facility. So this is going to be an opportunity for organizations to differentiate their facility and operations and really what they specialize in. So as an example, if an organization's collecting phones for repair, their scope's not going to be recycling of electronics or something broad like that that isn't specific to their operations, because it really needs to be reflective of the operations and the equipment that they're processing. So terms that when we see them in the scope like electronics, any use of that term at all really is going to be limited. It's only going to be for those that can collect and truly process all different types of electronics. You see here on the screen an example of a scope, and it includes the statement of what the organization is doing, the activities, the sanitization, test, repair, and the device that applies to the mobile phone. So really more specific there. The other thing that's included on this certificate will be the appendices that are certified to. So the statement of scope and then those appendices that it covers as well. So you can see here between this and the listing on the R2 certified website, that information or level of detail is really going to provide some transparency to customers on the specific or applications or activities that an organization undertakes. So core requirement 2 then is the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. And this is essentially a carryover from R2 2013. So if you've seen it there, it's really the same. But this is an important section because the key here is maximizing the environmental benefit from used electronics and from the processing of those items. So the hierarchy requires really the circular approach. We try to extend the useful life of electronics through reuse first. Then we would look at processing for materials recovery when reuse is not feasible. And the key is to only consider disposal as a last resort when no other options are available or you've exhausted all those other options. So I always mention this section to folks just as a reminder that R2 is not solely an end of life standard. Reuse is required, but it's not always a complete device. In some cases, reuse can apply to parts or components as well. And not all facilities are actually going to undertake those test and repair activities that are associated with reuse, but they're going to be able to identify what's capable of reuse and then direct that equipment and components accordingly to the right downstream spot. So if we skip ahead to core requirement 5, this is tracking throughput. And this section is rather straightforward as well, but I mention it because these requirements are really going to be a foundational piece for the audit process. So the section covers the tracking of what's going into the operations, what's being processed or in process, and what's going out and where does it go. So for those that are going to be going through the audit process, be ready for this. This is really where your auditors are going to get the information, help form their audit trails, and to test the facility's processes. So if you have an incoming loads or volumes, auditors are going to want to know, what was received, how much was there, and when was it received. And they're going to look to see when was it processed, how was it processed, what were the outputs and or the result of that, and are there records for that after processing, and what's the on-hand inventory then as well. And then finally, they go and look to see, what's transferred out and where did it go, and was that to an approved spot or downstream vendor. So the key really is not just looking at inbound inventory and outbound volumes individually, but this is really going to form that entire audit process as a whole and be able to follow equipment and materials through the operations using the applicable records. So an example I would say is if a shipment of computers is received, auditor is going to want to know where did they go, how were they handled, were they secured in accordance with the data security requirements, then were they sanitized properly, and are there records of that? Were they tested? What was tested? Are there records for that, for those testing activities? And then what was the level of functionality and so on. So you can see every single incoming shipment can be used to test many different aspects of the facility's processes. The key here really is tracking throughput's going to require records of transactions, and that includes an inbound and outbound summary report, and it also requires some inventory tracking. So all that information needs to be recorded, obviously, records available, but I say readily available for the purpose of the audit because that's really what the auditor is going to be looking for. So I mentioned previously that section 6, the sorting, categorization, and processing requirements, was a new section or the primary change to the core requirements. And again, recognizing that there's diverse types of operations under the R2 standard that can be covered under the R2 standard, and that not all are going to perform the same processes. This section really was developed to address this unique challenge and ensure that regardless of which R2 facility handles the equipment or materials, the processing outcomes would be the same. So it essentially creates an approved processing pathway for R2 facilities that don't perform certain processing functions. For example, if an organization, if they don't perform reuse operations themselves, they can still evaluate and sort equipment for reuse and meet the intent of that hierarchy. And if they're not doing data sanitization, they can help to at least, or this can help them to identify what needs to be controlled for data and then determine what the next steps in processing should be. Again, not every device is going to be handled the same, so it helps to identify and separate those out. The key in this section really is identifying the specific status of equipment and materials, and that can be at any point throughout the process because it really does change as equipment and materials are processed. And so we see things like data devices. We want to make sure, in particular, they're secured and sanitized, whether it's by the facility or a downstream vendor. Items are evaluated for reuse potential and they get directed accordingly. And then finally, the FMs, or the focus materials, they're properly managed as well and processed for materials recovery. So the next section of the standard then is Core Requirement 7, and this deals with data security. So this section goes hand in hand with the data sanitization requirements, which is covered also in Appendix B, which is a specialty process requirement. But as I mentioned, not all facilities are going to perform the data sanitization activities. So again, this structure has been designed to accommodate both the R2 facility that performs sanitization, or if they even outsource that activity to a downstream vendor. So if we focus just first here at the data security section, the focus of these requirements are really two key areas. First is to establish physical controls within the facility and the operations to secure and manage data devices or potentially data containing devices. And we really want to protect those against any unauthorized access, whether that's customers coming in the door to drop stuff off, or whether it's workers as well. So anybody that shouldn't be within access to those devices. Then the second part is really to develop the plan for sanitization. Now that we've identified what's data containing, how are we going to have that sanitized? So we have to look at the different types of devices, of course, because the data sanitization requirements are going to change for how they're sanitized. What types of data do we need to focus on, and what's the proper way to sanitize those individual devices? So that's really what that second part of the plan is for. So Core 7 also defines the acceptable sanitization methods, and it can be physical destruction in accordance with the NIST guidelines, which can be done under the Core Requirement 7, and a facility can do that. So that's typically shredder type organization where, or manual dismantler, where you could get equipment in, you can often would be maybe like consumer type collection stuff that is dated, often not working, broken. It's not a lot of reuse value or potential in it. And so that stuff would just go straight to destruction. And that destruction process could be part of the data sanitization. But obviously, due to the destruction aspect, it's applicable for end of life equipment only. So the other option then is to have the device sanitized in accordance with the Appendix B data sanitization requirements. And again, this can be by the facility or outsourced to a downstream vendor. Another requirement here under the Core 7 is for the assignment of a data protection representative. And so this is an individual assigned this role that has the overall responsibility and really the authority for the facility's data security and compliance program. So they don't necessarily have to do all the work themselves, but they're the overall authority or individual responsible for the data security aspect. So I often equate this to what you would see as an EHS, Environment, Health, and Safety representative, somebody that's really required to coordinate those activities and be part of that management system. So this is very similar on the data side. So if we take a look now more specifically at the Appendix B data sanitization requirements, you're going to notice here is a significant increase in the level of controls as well as the verification that's required for data sanitization. So you'll also note that logical or software-based sanitization can only be performed under Appendix B. So if you're looking for somebody to logically sanitize the device, they would have to be certified to Appendix B. So this is really why B is considered a specialty process. Organizations are going to have to make some investments in perhaps technology, but skills, competency, training, and understanding to be able to process these items and perform these functions. So it's not about just manually wiping a device or using a factory reset. Under B, facilities have to have an enhanced level of security. They have to have additional level of tracking of devices and really keeping record and verification that this data sanitization process is being performed and successful. So certification to this appendix really is going to be a differentiator because, as I said, there's investment in methods, skills, technology to properly sanitize and track all these devices. It's also going to be like a different type of service that's being offered. As I mentioned, under the core, the physical destruction is often first equated with low end, kind of consumer grade, end of life stuff. And really, what we're looking at here, when you have customers that have um, devices they want device specific tracking for records of sanitization to those devices, they're going to require this level of service. They're going to also want if the items are destined for reuse or intended for reuse, if there's still value in them, it obviously has to go through this process and be logically sanitized. So that's going to be a critical component for those that are in the ITAD side or processing side, as well as people that are managing return equipment streams and things like that. So what's important here is R2v3 has directly incorporated data security and sanitization requirements into the standard. And the consideration was to look at and recognize an external standard, but the thought was because this area is in such change and such a large area in the electronics industry now in terms of data capture and sanitization, the intent was to incorporate the requirements directly in the standard. So this is definitely a longer section. There's more detail here, but that's why that accounts for some of that detail is incorporating all of that right in the standard. So you can see here is a significant increase in data security and data sanitization requirements in R2v3. Often the next step after data sanitization is going to be test and repair. So this is covered under Appendix C. And similar to data sanitization, this has been an area of significant increase in the level of controls and then also the verification that's required for test and repair activities. The intent of test and repair is really to focus on quality and functionality of devices. So devices must both be tested, they must be verified functional, and then they're given an appropriate level of functionality category, as I mentioned from the rec, or a cosmetic description, or sorry, as well as a cosmetic description. So the thing here is this isn't just about grading devices visually or based on physical defects or powering them on. We really need to ensure that test and repair is focused on the functionality of the equipment. So to start in this area, any R2 facility certified to this requirement is going to have to maintain a certified quality management system as well. So that would either be a RIOS or an ISO 9001, for instance. And this means that these facilities are going to have the foundation of a quality management system in which they build these other or incorporate these other R2 requirements into and build their operations on top of that. So in terms of the R2 requirements, the facility here is really going to need to develop a detailed reuse plan. It's going to include all their instructions, their test plans, things like test records and quality controls. Really, it's essentially everything from the test point, confirming the functionality, and then demonstrating that level of functionality. Facilities also are going to have to maintain a product safety plan under this section. And this is really going to be used to identify and address conditions that would affect device safety. So this could include things like responding to recalls, how they're going to manage that. And then, as I mentioned, test and repair also leverages the R2 equipment categorization document that I talked about earlier. So those functional products, they're going to be assigned that functional category. They're also going to be assigned a cosmetic category. And these go beyond the basic descriptions of key functions. So it's going to provide more detail on specific function and conditions of any equipment that's available for reuse. So test and repair, the key here is it entails much more than just a visual grading of equipment or its condition. And we really want to see, or we really require the facilities to ensure they have verifiable testing and confirmation of the functionality that they assigned. So we know that not every device can be reused, and for different equipment and materials, they have different special, often processing needs. So in order to be able to handle this complex stream of equipment, organizations typically require a network of specialized processors that they partner with. And any R2 facility that's not a final point in the processing chain, they're going to need to plan and manage their downstream chain. So planning of the downstream chain really starts in core requirement 8 under focus materials. And this is essentially the same as the 2013 requirement. Their facility must identify The focus materials are the equipment containing focus materials that it manages, and then plan how that's going to be handled throughout the processing chain. Then the process for selecting and verifying the downstream vendors is covered under the process requirement in Appendix A. So this is not unlike current requirements for qualifying downstream vendors, but they've been placed in the process requirements section because these are applicable not to all facilities. If you're the final step in the processing chain, such as a smelter, then you wouldn't have a downstream chain. So that's why it's a specialty process. All other recyclers, though, or organizations within the chain are really going to have this network of downstream partners. So another new requirement here, when an R2 facility is selecting their downstream vendors, under V3, there's a couple of advantages when they're going to be using an R2 certified downstream vendor. So the first is that because the downstream vendor has already been independently audited and certified to the R2v3 standard, to qualify that downstream, the R2 facility only has to confirm that the downstream certification is active and it's for the applicable scope of operations required. So the second advantage when they're using an R2 certified downstream, again, because that downstream chain's already been independently audited and certified, the R2 can stop its downstream tracking at the next R2. That's if it chooses to. So in order to do this, however, the facility needs to register their portion of the downstream chain to SERI. And that enables just mapping of the entire chain. So whatever the R2 facility sends out, everything they send out to the first R2 facility would need to be mapped and registered with SERI. And that process is actually quite simple. We've got it active now, and it's a link that the R2 facility would be provided, an online link, sorry, to a form. They submit their information on their downstream chart, how many downstreams it has, some key information that can be verified, and then they attach an electronic version of the flow chart. And we recognize there's different versions that different ways and software that organizations can be used. So there's no specific format for that. Now, all of this doesn't mean that a non-R2 downstream vendor cannot be used. Non-R2s can still be used in the downstream chain. And in fact, they still need to meet the same R2v3 requirements as what the R2 facility has to. However, the difference really is in how they're verified. So in this case, because the non-R2 hasn't been already audited and certified, it's the R2 facility's responsibility to do that downstream verification of their downstream vendors. They need to collect that information and demonstrate that they meet those R2 requirements. So as part of the downstream chain, for anything that's not reusable, it's ultimately going to end up here into Appendix E, which is materials recovery. And this appendix covers two broad types of organizations. There's first those that specialize in the breakdown of electronics, and this could be both manual as well as mechanical processing. And they're the organization that really recover material streams like circuit boards, wires, metals, plastics, and things like that. And then the second types of organizations are really those that typically are downstream vendors to those facilities, and they handle those material streams and do further processing of them and the actual materials recovery often. So they would refine specific streams like circuit boards, recover precious metal, for instance. So you can see just based on these two broad categories, many different types of facilities, many different types of operations that can be covered under this appendix. But the common factor with all those organizations or operations really is that these material recovery processes often pose a higher risk to worker safety and the environment. These are organizations that are now handling things like the batteries, the mercury bulbs, the leaded glass, and so higher risk potentially. And so Appendix E really is designed to manage those higher risk applications. It builds upon the environmental health and safety requirements that are defined in Core Requirement 3. So Core Requirement 3 applicable to all organizations so that all organizations manage their risks. But Appendix E has a higher level enhanced hazard assessment process. And we've often heard that much of the requirements should already be included in a robust environmental health and safety management system. So some of these requirements really are repeat when we get into Appendix E, but what they are common hazards or commonly identified risks within the industry. And so these have been specifically identified to ensure that regardless of the organization and their style of management system and what it covers, really these items have to be specifically addressed through their EHS control programs. So specialty electronics is a very specific type of equipment stream. So this is not at all consumer type equipment or devices. It's generally commercial industrial grade equipment. It has specific purpose and function. So it includes things like commercial telecom equipment, medical devices, maybe laboratory or scientific equipment. And it's things that you're not going to find in a local retailer. So with specialty electronics like this, the challenge is they're very highly sophisticated. They often require very specialized testing equipment, sometimes even a live working environment to be able to really confirm their functionality. So testing of these devices is sometimes just not feasible. But what we want to ensure, again, in providing the maximum environmental benefit, is that there is an opportunity still to reuse these devices. And so it can take two pathways. And the first is one that organizations will be familiar with under R2 2013. It's that 1% rule. So an organization can sell this collectible or specialty electronics equipment without the full testing if it's up to 1% of their unit sales. And that's permitted under the core requirements. So this section, specialty electronics for use, which is the alternate pathway, this is under Appendix D. This is really going to focus on organizations that specialize in a particular piece or area of equipment sector, because they have to work within that sector. So it's going to be a very specific certification. And what this does is it allows them to work within the channel on the deinstallation of a piece of working equipment, conduct certain verifications of those devices where the testing isn't possible, and then they can sell that equipment for reuse to an organization that requires that equipment. And it's really meant to be that full management of the channel from deinstall to reinstall, and knowing where that equipment's going so that in the event it isn't functional, should something happen, it can go back to the R2 facility for proper recycling or parts management, whatever the case is. So certification here is really going to be very specific to a specific type of organizations, and probably not a lot will apply under this. So the final process requirement under R2v3 is Appendix F, and it deals with brokering. So this really applies when a facility is sourcing equipment or materials and they control the delivery direct to a downstream vendor, and they don't actually physically receive or process the equipment or material in any way. So the intent here is to recognize these brokered transactions, allow them to apply under the R2 standard, and ensure that any of the R2 requirements that apply are applied in that certification. And so there's a similar brokering allowance that's in place under R2 2013, and there's some instances where the requirements don't apply. So specifically, if the organization's not handling any equipment, components, or materials, nothing ever passes through their facility, then they wouldn't need to be core requirement 3 EHS. They wouldn't require certification to that requirement. That wouldn't apply. Same with the core 9 requirements for facility requirements. So those also aren't required. It's very much in line with the brokering allowance, but this means that a broker can still be certified and all those other applicable requirements under R2 would still apply. So for instance, the broker would still need to qualify all their downstream vendors under Appendix A, the downstream recycling chain, still need to track their throughput, as I mentioned in the core requirements, and they maintain records of all their transactions for audit and verification. But because that EHS requirement and the management systems is not required within core requirement 3, what we saw here is a gap that the TAC wanted to address, and that's with a quality management system. So since the organization doesn't have the other management systems, the EHS, to build its R2 programs on, the idea here is to at least implement a quality management system that is applicable to their operations, and they can use that as the foundation for building their R2 activities. So overall, I would say R2v3 was developed to be a comprehensive risk management tool. So we want it to better represent the scope of the changing industry. We know we've got collectors, refurbishers, materials recovery organizations, and many combinations within that of organizations that are doing a variety of those different aspects. So really strengthened requirements, more specific requirements in some areas. Was intended to raise the bar for those activities and manage those risks. But also, this is really now allows for specialization, this format and the structure of the standard, specialization within the industry and transparency into all those operations, what each facility is actually performing in terms of R2 activities or services. So a real benefit here and an opportunity for organizations to differentiate themselves. In the end, I think what we really see here is our hope for is some improved application of the requirements by providing more clarity on them, allowing for better auditing and ensuring conformance with them. I think this is really going to lead to more consistent application as we move forward with R2v3. And hopefully, what we want to see ultimately is confidence in the certification under these requirements. So here you see the rollout timeline for R2v3. I mentioned the official launch was July 1st of last year, and there's a 3-year transition from that date to get all of our 950 certified facilities up to this revised standard. So already as of January 1st this year, any new R2 certifications are required to be to R2v3. So new applications come in, they're going to be moving over to that standard already. And then those that are currently R2 certified, they have until the end of this year to be audited still under the 2013 standard. And then as of next January, audits are going to start to be conducted to R2v3 and organizations will be transitioning over. And this timeline, this period really is intended to give organizations, all organizations, at least a year and a half to update their processes, procedures to meet the R2v3 requirements, as well as certification bodies to upgrade their processes. We also have auditor training that much of it has been completed. New auditor training is scheduled as well. So there's lots of changes to get organizations ready for the new version of the standard. So also to support our implementation of R2v3 series released, and we're continuing to work on a number of additional resources. We have a new website. If you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to go take a look. Lots of information available there. It's SERI-R2.org. And one of the things that particularly if you're on the R2 facility, consultant, or auditor side, you want to take a look at our knowledge base. And there's a number of information and training resources that are available there, but we're continuing to add more, like I said, all the time. So what I would suggest is take a look at our level 1 training modules. These really explain the intent of each section of the R2 standard. Then we have level 2 training module, again, for each element or each section of the standard. And then it goes through and describes the fundamentals of that section in more detail. So the level 1s are a few minutes a piece. Level 2s more to the 8 to 10 minutes long each. So trying to give a good understanding of what those requirements are for each section. The other thing that we're doing, we have some guidance available. We're continuing to develop this on an as-needed basis, and we have some Q&As as well that are posted on the knowledge base. These are from questions that we're receiving and some from public consultations that we had previously. So again, continuing to develop more of this, and we'll put it on there. I encourage you to take a look at the knowledge base. And as you can see on the screen from that short snippet, there is a search function there. So we really hope it's going to be a lot easier for people to find the content they're looking for. We also have a new R2 facility search tool. So that's another one that you want to take a look at to find R2 certified facilities. And once facilities get R2v3 certified, you're going to be able to use this search and with some much more detailed criteria. So you can find facilities by area, of course, something that's current or close to your current location. Those are easy standard searches, but if you're looking for somebody that's specializing in a particular function like ITAD, where they're doing test and repair and data sanitization, there's some of those opportunities or options as well to be able to change that search function. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. And then, of course, we have our regular updates that we provide on all things R2. And if you register for our newsletter or you follow our page on LinkedIn, the R2 certification page, there you'll see regular updates from us. And you can get links to both of those from our website at the bottom of the page as well. So with that, that concludes the high-level overview of R2v3. Of course, there's much more to the standard that we could talk about, but I hope I've covered at least the main topics and really some of those connections within the standard, as I had mentioned. So happy to have any questions that folks have either now or my contact information is here. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions at all, and encourage you to take a look at some of those resources. So thank you very much for your time today.
All right, thank you, Sean. Thanks for that very thorough update. So now we're going to field some questions for Sean. Again, if you have a question, use the dialog box, the Q&A feature on your dialog box there. So so right now we don't have any questions, so that does prove that this was a very thorough update, Sean. So we'll wait a minute or two here. I hate to ask this, but you're always, you're on your third version. What's the timeline for any future revisions to the R2 standard?
Well, as I indicated, the requirement for the ANSI requirement is for us to conduct a 5-year review. And in order to do that, we'll probably start kind of 2 years in, taking a look at the current process, where we're at, if there are any changes that we want to make, and then we'll start drafting those so that we can go back out to that public review and comment process as well. And we have to follow those same step procedures. So we definitely try to do that ahead of time. Now, what I would say is we've also had some interest expressed from folks within the PV or photovoltaic industry. And the interest is to add those in, or to look and see if photovoltaics could be added into the R2 standard. So I expect that we'll be getting something from that group in the near future. And that would be an initiation to the TAC or a recommendation to do a review. And so if we do that, we would start earlier, and we would start focused, of course, on that particular aspect and work that into the review process.
Okay. We do have some questions now. Does the code of practice require an additional on-site audit to address non-conformances?
There's not an additional on-site required necessarily. What I would say is it's always the certification body's prerogative to, if they need to verify something, there is a requirement to do a follow-up verification. But again, that can be done remotely, as some of the audit processes are. So it does depend on the scale of the issue and if the CB does need to verify something, but not a requirement per se for every time.
Okay. This attendee asks, how much does the entire process of rolling out R2v3 cost?
It's a very difficult question because it really depends on the organization, what you're doing, and how prepared you are at the start. So I'll give you a couple of key factors. There's the planning and management first off, and so that's taking a look at the standard, conducting your own gap analysis, identifying the things that you need to do within your operations to meet the standard. You do that work. So a lot of that work can be done internal. If you have the resources and capacity to do that, you may want to look at hiring somebody with knowledge of the industry, the standard, to assist with that. So that could be a cost. There's the environmental health and safety management certifications that I mentioned. There's some audit time that's required with that. There's also the R2 audit time. And as I indicated, that's really variable based on the types of operations. So you can have more audit time for more complex operations. And then, of course, the R2, the R2 license fee. I was going to say the certification, the license fee that once you are certified, there's a $2,000, I believe it is right now, annual fee for registration. So there's a few costs there.
Right. If a recycler states that they are R2 certified, but they do not indicate what version, is that something that I should scrutinize? And will you allow recyclers to keep just their R2 or R2v2 standing?
So I mentioned the R2 facility search tool on the website. If you go on there, it's going to be very clear by that facility, by that location, which version they're certified to, whether it's V2 or V3. And I mean, so you can take their word for it. You can look at their certificate. You can look at the website. So it's really just depends on what level of detail you need. If you need to ensure they're meeting the V3 requirements, or if you're just looking for them to be R2 certified. Now, so I was just also looking at the standing changes online. And yeah, I think it really just depends on if you need a specific V3 requirement or if you're just looking for R2 certification.
Okay. Are there any required procedures or just required records / evidence for R2v3?
There are a lot of required procedures. There are a number of plans, as I mentioned, like a reuse plan, a data sanitization plan. So the key here is really to understand the scope of those applications within your operation. So if you're not doing the data sanitization, as I mentioned, and you're just an organization collecting those things, you still have to have the plan. You map out what you're going to be collecting, how it's going to be managed, where it's going to go to be sanitized, and how it's going to be managed downstream. So there's a lot of that planning, very much like the focused material management plan that you would currently have to do, but it's in other areas as well.
Okay. I think that's the last of the questions. So, I think we'll start wrapping it up here. So again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Recycling Market Center websites. And thanks again for joining us. We hope you'll join us for next month's webinar. And please visit our the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And again, Sean, thanks for taking your time out to provide this update.
Thanks again for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Okay. All right. So have a great day, everybody. So long.